Hello and welcome back, and that is right, today we are returning to the subject of the Samsung 9100 Pro SSD. I've actually already reviewed this drive quite a few months ago. It was Samsung's very first fully fledged highfalutin Gen 5 drive. None of your pseudo Gen 4, Gen 5, we ain't got no DRAM drive. This was a bona fide Gen 5 for consumers and businesses alike there. However, why am I returning to it today? I very rarely return to reviewing SSDs, largely because firmware updates are so infrequent and so small that you generally don't re-review an SSD for much notable reasons. However, this is slightly different. This is the 8TB model. Now, 8TB Gen 5 SSDs, they're not new, but I will say they're sort of rare. Notwithstanding, the cost of Gen 5 SSDs are still in notable degree higher than their alternatives in Gen 3 and Gen 4. These things happen over time. But Gen 5 drives, because the price point is so high and the scale up of the other components inside, such as the DRAM, have to be scaled up notably as well, very few brands that enter the Gen 5 SSD space actually tackle 8TB because of reasons of heat and of course reasons of component cost driving things up. Now, the price tag on this, again, whether you're going to look at the RRP, whether you're going to look at the general currency conversion and tax and stuff like that, for you US guys, it is around $799 to $899 without the tax. In the UK, I saw prices of around $850 to $900 knocking around. And the specifications scale quite notably and comparably to the 2 and 4 TB drives currently available. So that 8TB of storage, 740 gigabytes of over-provisioned performance storage there inside. Now, the noted reported maximum performance by Samsung themselves is 14.8 gigabytes read over 13.4 gigabytes per second right now. Now, keep in mind that is using an insane Gen 5 AMD based system. I did my testing on a Windows domestic system because I wanted to make sure we could get real world results where possible. So I'm going to tell you right now, I never hit those high numbers. I got pretty close, I will say, in a couple of cases, but I never hit those high numbers. Again, chapters along the bottom, you can find out more about the performance. Samsung have sent this drive to me. They haven't paid for the review. They've got no control over the review. I'm just reviewing it as is. But what about the hardware build? Again, when we took it apart, we'll get onto the heatsink later on. When it came to the onboard controller, it's the same controller we've seen used previously. That is the Samsung Presto controller, and that's an ARM 32-bit R8 Cortex processor, and that's 5-core. Now, as it's an 8TB, you'll be unsurprised here, they've scaled up that DRAM to match that, and that is an 8GB LPDDR4 DRAM there. So that's tons of DRAM to be getting the job done for those consistent high writes, because that's the thing with Gen 5. Notwithstanding heat, it is maintaining that performance for as long as possible before the cache gets oversaturated and the drive drops down. Now, next up, in terms of storage, this 8TB model has 4 DRAM modules, 2 on either side. Now, that is 236 layer 3D TLC NAND. That's their V8, and it's 4 individual 4TB chips at 2400 mega transfer rating for each of them. So they're going for a decent level of component there. And again, as this is Samsung, much like WD, these are all in-house components. There's no borrowing a Phison controller there, borrowing some HIC or HK DRAM there. It is all Samsung in-house. Now, it is Gen 5 times 4, so that is a maximum potential 16 gigabytes per second bandwidth to play with. You're never going to hit that, of course, and whether you're working out, we'll come back to this later on, with decimal or binary calculations based on raw storage versus OS storage, but still, this is a genuine Gen 5 drive. None of that pseudo breakdown as mentioned earlier on at NVMe 2.0. Now, in terms of durability, because again, Gen 5 drives, very few Gen 5 drives have durability above 0.3 to 0.38 drive writes per day. Gen 4, they've got better. We've actually seen a few 1 drive write per day Gen 4 drives And again, outside of the enterprise sector, where you do generally find those anyway, but you've got to pay top dollar, you'll be unsurprised to hear this still maintains that 0.3 drive writes per day. That translates to 4,800 terabytes written to this drive annually. And again, that's all detailed on their own pages. And of course, you can use the Samsung Magician tool to update your firmware and monitor the health of the drive. You can get that regardless, it's free, although you can download it. That's not part of the purchase. Take advantage of that, do what you will. But of course, you're not paying through the nose just for that capacity. You want performance. And Samsung, rolling out a drive this big with that many components, were expecting this to give us good numbers. So I got this thing loaded into a Windows 10 system in a Gen 5 PCIe card, just like we did with our previous one. And that is loaded in, by the way, to our Johnsbow test machine with the drive mounted in a PCIe card with just the system fans for active cooling. That's the other thing. This is a Gen 5 SSD with 8 TB on board, and it doesn't have active cooling. So I was expecting this thing to fry eggs. More on that later on. But the first test was a fairly domestic Windows transfer, and it was a 50 gig file transfer of 1,700 files, mixed every kind you can think of, everything from ISOs to simple images to INI files, music, video, and more. And that transfer of 50 gig took 46 seconds. So that's a little over an average 1 gigabyte per second transfer. Again, I didn't expect this to be a consistent 14.8 gig as their marketing suggests there, because that is using synthetic testing, but a gigabyte per second sustained over 46 seconds, I was quite happy with that. Next up came the testing with AJA, and I did 4 separate tests there of file sizes at 1 gig, 4 gig, 16 gig and 64 gigabytes there, and that was sustained consistent performance there at 1080i file type. Now I saw numbers of around 8 to 9.8, and that was over 10.5 to 10.6 gigabytes per second peak across all of the tests there. You always find with AJA, because it is dense video files there, and the way it's making, you don't see the same consistent numbers, but it's designed for more kind of video file handling there. I will highlight, if you look at the graph there at the bottom during all of the tests, the sustained performance. That's what we were looking for to see if there was any notable drops. That red line there, I'm pleased to say that the read-write performance there was sustained performance. So let's go for something a little bit more synthetic for a little bit of guidance there. So I moved over to CrystalDisk. Now, CrystalDisk was 3 separate tests, a 1 gigabyte, a 4 gigabyte, and 16 gigabyte file test there. And we looked at first the standard performance there, and we saw 13.5 peak read performance there, and we saw 11.8 peak write performance. So much closer to what we were looking for there, around about a gigabyte or so off the manufacturer's peak number there in terms of read, and in write just around about a gig and a half. I will highlight 1.4 million IOPS was the peak read IOPS I achieved there on this setup. I was not running a high performance drive synthetic test machine there, so I was never going to hit the reported 2.2 million and 2.6 million read-write IOPS respectively that the manufacturer's own web pages detail. But still, I was happy with what I saw, and again, consistent numbers, or even saw decent enough numbers there over the mixed 30 to 70% read-write as well. I should say 70 over 30. Finally, there was the test with ATTO Disk Benchmark there, and again, 3 separate tests, 1 gigabyte, 4 gigabyte, and 16 gigabyte. And I saw, in terms of read and write performance there, 13.15 gigabytes per second over 11.70 gigabytes per second. Again, factor in between all of these tests, the difference between that binary and decimal measurements there, the individual megabytes over testing 4 gigabytes, and of course that breaks all the way down 2 megabits as well. But ultimately, ATTO there got even closer to what we were hoping to see in terms of overall performance numbers, matching that of the manufacturer's own synthetic peaks, and overall it was that sustained performance throughout those tests, and not seeing the inevitable crash that we've seen with Gen 5 drives. But it was really the temperature of this drive that I'm looking forward to talking about a great deal more, because I had very low expectations for how this would handle temperatures. And when I did my testing of this without the heatsink on the 2TB model several months ago, the temps were all right, but they weren't breathtaking. So how did it live on the 8TB with a larger separation of storage across the drive? Because again, we've got 4 2TB NANDs. How did that come through? Well, I'm pleased to say it was very good. The peak temperature I saw during this operation in my casing there was a peak of just 52 degrees. And that was across all of the testing that I performed that you saw on screen there over the course of just over an hour. But it was the dissipation of that heat that I really liked. It went down to 41 degrees pretty rapidly between each of those tests, where I would give the system just 3 minutes cooldown. So it took, within 3 minutes, it took it down from 52 degrees to 41 degrees without proactive cooling on the drive, just heavily reliant on that heatsink dissipating the heat into the air. And I was really curious about that. So although I didn't really want to take this drive apart and invalidate potentially some of that cooling, I was so impressed by that, I had to get inside and have a look. It's held together with 6 hex screws on 3 hex screws on either side of the casing there. And I noted a few little unique bells and whistles about the cooling on this. So number one, when you opened it up, the thermal pad placement inside there is frankly above and beyond a lot of what I've seen. It wasn't just one big thermal pad or 2 or 3 thermal pads specifically placed on the controller and the DRAM, when the DRAM, of course, you want to let get a little warm. It was all over the place with varying levels of height, with varying thermal pad types across different components inside. And indeed, one half of the thermal pad actually was tiered in terms of its height there. So the thermal pad and the metal paneling inside had been tiered to meet the individual components, and with different kinds of thermal pads to aid or lessen dissipation, because you do want the NAND to be a little warm there rather than the controller, which you want to be as cool as possible. Also, and this is probably something no one's really going to appreciate outside of a reviewer, the drive placement for the thermal pad, there's a lovely little hole on the end of the SSD itself that sits on top of a little tiny nodule built into the casing, which meant that taking it apart and putting it back together was the easiest I've ever done, while still maintaining the integrity of the heatsink. Again, probably something most users never even going to see, but the fact that it was included in there means that if you wanted to perform maintenance in terms of cleaning or whatever, getting inside this and replacing it was really smooth. But nevertheless, despite that, they do stick a, if you remove this screw, you are buggering your warranty sticker. So clearly this has not been designed to be regularly accessed anyway, and doing so will obviously knacker that 5-year hardware warranty. I sincerely hope this 8TB is the start of an increase of availability for 8TB drives at the Gen 5 level. This is very expensive, and almost certainly that RRP price that this happens with all Samsung drives is going to come down real quick, because Samsung, like WD, are one of those brands that love to engage in a promotion or sale. And right now, as I've mentioned in previous videos several times, you can pick up 4TB in the Gen 4 arena right now for as little as $200. So this knocking around at $800 to $900 for 8TB, you're going to want this to deliver performance when you could just get 2 4TB Gen 4 drives, which already give you 6 to 7 gigabytes per second already at half the price of this. I will say that this is a well put together drive, and to Samsung's credit, this is one of the best passive heat sinks I've ever seen, not even just on Gen 5, but on Gen 4 as well. This is what a lot of people wanted to see, and maybe, and I don't want to give them too much credit, I can understand why they might have waited to enter Gen 5 before everyone else saturated the market there. Do I think it was a justified decision? No, but I can see why they wanted their Gen 5 8TB to be the dog's danglies, and I think it is. Is it pricey? Yes. Does it deliver? Yes. Let me know what you guys think in the comment. There'll be a written review below, and as long as Samsung stay on top of these firmware updates and don't have a few snafus like they had in the past, I think this is going to fast become the standard Gen 5 SSD right now. It's just a question of how quickly everyone else rolls out their own 8 TBs as well. Thank you so much for watching. There'll be a link in the description to both the written review and a few different retailers where you can get hold of this drive for yourself. If you found this video helpful, and if you want to go to those stores anyway, please use those links in order to do so. This channel, the videos we make, exist thanks to either ad revenue from these videos or the commission we get from you using those links. So doing so allows us to keep making these videos and provide the support that we do. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.